Can you hear me?
Yes.
No? Yes?
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. You made the right decision to come and be with us tonight. And let me again repeat the name of the class: Jews and Refugees, Text versus Experience, Two New Histories and 2,000 Years of Tradition. And I can think of no finer instructor than Dr. Tom Timberg. Tom has had a primary career as an international economic development consultant focused on South Asia, and he worked for 23 years with Nathan Associates here in the Washington area. A paper of his comparing India and Bangladesh development, which was to be given this year because of COVID, will be given at a conference next year. Tom always has projects afoot, and he's now finishing a study of the 1994 Bombay Silver Corner. And I leave it to the curious of you to figure out what that means. It will be very interesting. It has to do, obviously, with cornering the silver market. Okay, Tom has had a long-term interest in the Jews of India. In fact, he edited a book published in 1978 on the Jews of India. Tom has taught a number of classes in recent years at the Jewish Studies Center, and a number of the classes have had accompanying essays in which Tom elaborates on the themes of his presentations. Some of his talks have also stemmed from his interest in Islamic finance. Subjects in which Tom has given classes are Jewish slavery, found in Indian Jewish archives. He's taught and has been very interested in Eastern European yeshiva finance, and on Chaim Grada, the eminent Yiddish writer, one of the most eminent of the 20th century. And now let's turn to Tom.
As I say, I'm thankful to everybody for coming, and very honored to be speaking here. As with many of the previous sessions, this session emerged in the first instance for reasons I think we all share, which is with the contemporary refugee crisis, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States. Everybody thinks about the human issues involved. But in addition, Jews are very conscious of the our failures of Jews and the failures of countries to receive refugees in the 19th, and the effect of that on killing 6 million people. And so, given that background, about a year and a half ago, I went to a class run by one of the local rabbis in which he went through some of the traditional sources on the question of refugees. And the key point is, at the same time, 2 new books have emerged dealing with the refugee question. And in fact, what you now see is Adam Teller's book, which is primarily on the Khmelnytsky revolt, and something which is often confused with it, which is the refugees from the Russo-Swedish War. Robert Chazan's book, which I'm not going to talk about much here because the book itself is really focused on another question. It has to do with the famous question of Simon Dubnoff about attacks on the lachrymose theory of Jewish history, and emphasizes the extent to which Jewish migration over the last 2,000 years has been motivated by opportunity rather than oppression, and it's I'm not sure it's correct. But the third thing was what's immediately set this off, which was in this class, he introduced a sermon by a rabbi who died in 1937, but we would say, therefore, figure the first part of the 20th century, known as the Altar of Mir. And I want you to know The Alter of Mir was no liberal. He was one of the leaders of the Musar movement in Eastern Europe, and he gave a sermon on the Parsha Vayera, which has to do with Sodom and Lot and those things. And he suggested that perhaps America, which he, in the sermon, analogized, this is probably about 1930, to Sodom, was experiencing the Great Depression because of its reluctance to accept refugees. Now, as I say in the essay and go into this, this is partially based on a proposition that I think relatively few of us are very happy with. It's a principle of mida keneged mida, that the penalties that people get in this world are connected with the sins in this world. But we'll forget about that. The sermon draws, as you will see, fairly heavily on the Talmudic and rabbinic sources on the subject. And I just give, this is actually the teacher's translation. I have the Hebrew text if you want, but it's not much more clear than this. And he says, who knows? Perhaps because of this wickedness that they shut their doors to guests, they, America, arrived at the great crisis which prevails today in the entire world. I'm translating that as the Great Depression, for that was the sin of their sister Sodom and its enormous punishment. Earlier in the sermon, he explains that the similarity, which is both Sodom and America in his readings were very prosperous, wealthy countries, which a lot of people wanted to flee to. But the inhabitants were afraid that they would lose and therefore refused to practice hospitality. Now, we go to some of his sources, and the Ramban, Nachmanides, who's obviously 11th, 12th century rabbi, in his commentary referring to Sodom says, the intention of their immoral actions, this is Sodom, was to stop guests from coming among them. For they thought, but the goodness of their land, which was like the garden of Hashem, many would come there to settle and share their wealth, and they hated charity. Those of you who know the midrashes know the terrible things they did to people who practice charity. And then he has a quote from Ezekiel which says, behold, this was the iniquity of Sodom, your sister. Pride, abundance of bread, and careless ease was hers and her daughters, and she did not strengthen the hand of the needy. Okay, we go to the next. The next thing has actually the source in the Babylonian Talmud on Sodom. And what it says is, the Mishnah teaches us, the people of Sodom have no share in the world to come. The sages taught, the men of Sodom were wicked and sinned before the Lord exceedingly. That's a quote from Genesis. The people of Sodom said, since we live in a land from which bread comes and has the dust of gold, we have everything we need. Why do we need travelers as they come only to divest us of our property? So that's, and there are many more texts in the Shulchan Aruch and so forth in that general note. If we go to the next thing, however, there were obviously limitations, I shouldn't say obviously, there were limitations on this obligation to be hospitable. The first one, and this is really independently, and I haven't given all the sources, all the rabbinic sources are generally insistent, unlike some other religious traditions, that charity should not impoverish the giver. There is the rule that you've probably seen cited, that you shouldn't give more than 20% of your property. But it's obviously been true throughout history that they're very wealthy people who should give a lot more than, all these billionaires are giving 50%. There's no problem with that. And, but there is, in fact, a very explicit rule in the Mishnah Torah that you are not allowed to intentionally make yourself impoverished, so you need charity. It's an anti-Franciscan position. Now, the second thing is, and this is a separate set of rules, new market entrants can be limited to protect the livelihood of the people inside the market. So we have all the Talmudic sources, which some of you may know, that if there are a bunch of stores there, and if a new store would ruin all their business, you're not actually supposed to come. Now, this doesn't, and there are all kinds of circumstances. If somebody's exploitative, it doesn't apply, incidentally, to teachers. It doesn't, but and if what happens in the store is a terrible store, anyway, all those things are there. You'll excuse me just 1 second. This thing says my battery's running low, and it just means I have to plug something in quickly. Thank you. Sometimes my battery comes out. The third thing, which we're going to talk about a little more, is the medieval Hezkat HaYishuv, that entrance can be restricted by the community. And again, in my paper, I have the quotes from various medieval communities which had decrees that nobody could come into the community, or nobody could even assist somebody to come into the community without the community's permission. And there were a whole bunch of backgrounds here. One is that typically only a limited number of Jews were allowed to live in a given community. And so when refugees showed up, they had to do various kinds of negotiation. Now, you should know that in general, first place, this only applies basically to adult males because it has to do with livelihoods. So it doesn't apply to people who would have been dependent. It doesn't apply to students who come to study. It doesn't apply to rabbis probably. But this was a position, and it was very widely observed well into the 18th and perhaps even the early 19th century, all over Europe. And it obviously, again, it seems to contradict the duty of hospitality. Again, we'll be dealing with that in a session practical. The bulk of rabbinical opinion agrees with the right of a community to limit new entrants. And Moshe Isserly is the Ramah, who is the standard, I say, there's a thing called the Shulchan Aruch, but that's a Sephardic text, and therefore the Ashkenazim always deal with it with the commentary of the Ramah. Asserts that this is because of the objective conditions. You just have to permit a community to restrict entrance. But others, Rabbeinu Tam in particular, argued for a highly restrictive right he said, well, yeah, you can ban evildoers and nasty lying people, and he was in one case was very explicitly, but not their children. In other words, you have this evil guy, so you don't let him come to into the city. But if he has a kid, well, he can come. I mean, it's only an exceptional group of people. But as I say, the bulk of the medieval stuff endorses the Hezkat HaYishuv. The standard book on this, unfortunately, the only copy I could locate is in the Library of Congress, and the Library of Congress has been closed for 9 months. It's incidentally written by Louis Rabinowitz, who was a London rabbi of some prominence. It was printed in 1945. Okay, so now, what happens in practice? Now, again, there's a key point. All kinds of religious traditions say you should do something. People do them to lesser or greater degrees. The anthropologists often talk about a difference between the great tradition, the sacred books and so forth, and the little tradition, what people actually do. And when we look at one example, which Chazan treats a bit there, and there's a couple of other books that treat. In 1492, obviously, depending on who you believe, 100,000 people left Spain. Actually, a lot of them went to Navarre and to Portugal immediately. But anyway, they had a mixed reception. And we have more indication of this in Italy, but some indication that the reception in North Africa wasn't so good either. In Italy, Ibn Varga, who's historian of the period, was shocked that the Roman community simply turned away a group of refugees who'd come. I think first they came to Genoa, and then the Genoese passed them on. But the Ottomans welcomed settlers for various reasons, and that's why one of the major Spanish settlements is in Istanbul and Salonika and in that area. So that was 1492, and it's not as well documented. But next slide. Okay, Mr. Teller has come out with a book he has, if you go through his footnotes, he has, and it's not so expensive if you buy it as an ebook, has very detailed accounts of these 17th century refugees from Poland. And the first thing we have is the so-called Khmelnytsky Revolt of 1648 within Poland. In this case, in the Ukrainian peasants, led by a group of Cossacks headed by a guy named Khmelnytsky, rose against the primarily Polish Catholic landlords, and incidentally, the Jews who tended to be their managers and involved with them on the business side. They fled especially to Lithuania, and which the structural fact, if you want to get into it, the way Jewish society was organized in the 17th and 18th century, there's something that many people have probably heard of, the Vad Arba Aratzos, the four countries, which the sub-countries that were in Poland. One of them was Lithuania. It had its own Vad. The Vad of Lithuania told everybody that they had to take care of the people, and the estimate is about 20,000 Lithuanian Jews managed to accommodate about 2,000 of the 15,000 refugees here. But luckily, Khmelnytsky lost, and a lot of people went back, and a lot of people moved to other places. So that, for various reasons, wasn't as traumatic as the next problem. The next two problems. While Khmelnytsky was in the business of killing off and chasing out Polish nobles and Jewish businessmen, he was joined by the Crimean Tatars, who they didn't really care much about the issues, but they were in the slave business. And they captured between 2,000 and 6,000 slaves who, as was their wont, they took to sell in the Istanbul slave market. Fortunately, the Jews had a network that was already set up to redeem Jewish slaves. So once a slave arrived in Istanbul and it was determined that he was Jewish, somebody would, and they had their whole business and they wouldn't raise the price too far, they just bargained and so forth. They bought the slaves and got them mostly home. And this had been created originally to deal with all the pirates in the Mediterranean, you had businessmen traveling around the Mediterranean. They kept getting raided by pirates, and they would become slaves. In this case, obviously, the burden was enormous. These 2,000 to 6,000 people, expensive. So they sent out fundraisers to Amsterdam and Frankfurt, and they got a lot of money, and they indeed redeemed almost everybody, and they got them mostly back, though there were all kinds of issues. I mean, this was not a sort of such a liberal world where families didn't want to necessarily take back a woman who had been through the slave business and so forth, but they did mostly. And the third group is a group that's caused a bit more of a problem, and these were refugees connected with the so-called Northern War. There were actually two Russo and Swedish wars between 1655 and 1660, which, since it included, as you think of the geography, included Lithuania, they had to flee Poland altogether, and they went to Germany and Holland, and they went beyond. A little, local interest thing is Asser Levy, who is one of the founding fathers of the Jewish community of New York, was a feisty guy fighting Peter Stuyvesant for his rights and so forth. and still has a lot of descendants running around the United States. Anyway, Asser Levy was, and he was a refugee, and he got to Amsterdam, and then from Amsterdam he moved on to, I think, Recife before he moved to New York. But anyways, that's how he got to New York. But they were all over. I mean, they, again, Frankfurt refused to pay people. A lot of them stayed in Hamburg, and a number of the key families of court Jews in the 18th century were refugees who'd come to Hamburg. Next overhead. Okay, and Teller writes a lot about the fact that this being the first international Jewish network to provide funds to redeem Jewish refugees, and he points out that it sort of overlapped with efforts to raise funds to support the Jewish community in the Yishuv in Palestine, and it was refined over time. But this is really the point at which it became an operational international network. Yes, a couple of chapters on that. Yeah. Now, there are probably a lot of questions and statements and insights that people can share with me, and perhaps we can now do that.
Okay, folks, you need to share your questions with our chat function. But let me start off, Tom. There's so much that you've touched on. I'm curious in terms of the yeshiva students who came to study with some of the talented and revered rabbis. Now, were they wanted to stay on in the communities? We have in our own country all kinds of discussions of people coming here and working in technology, and they're going to take jobs away, and maybe they shouldn't come in the first place. Were the yeshiva bachas seen as long-term assets? Was it anticipated that they would go back? How are they perceived going forward?
That's a very good question. Incidentally, I mean, this goes really to another set of questions. At that point, this is before the creation of the 19th century Eastern European yeshivas. So yeshivas in this period, every town of any sort which had money, the rabbi, or maybe somebody who wasn't the rabbi, but usually the rabbi, taught classes in the synagogue. And if he was a great rabbi, people would come from all over, and they often would move from one to the other to study with these rabbis. And in fact, the rabbinical contracts that they got often specified that the community would support a number of students. But in addition to whatever the community supported, I mean, some people had private funds or whatever, they would come and study. Now, the first point is that they really weren't affected by the Hezkadah Yishuv. That was not they could come and go easily enough. The major constraint was, in fact, economic. So how many people could be, either how many people was the rabbi guaranteed by the community, or who had parents' money, or whatever. Now, as far as, I think it's fair to say that the way the rabbinical business worked at that point, people probably weren't very worried, because basically the people who did this had some resources behind them, and sometimes, to the extent they didn't, somebody who did have resources married off their daughters to them, so they got the resources. And of course, there was always more demand for employment than employment was available, so that was a problem. In fact, one of the issues, it becomes an issue in the early 19th century, is one of the things that the fathers and father-in-laws would do is buy the rabbinates. And the rabbinates were sold in many cases. And Hatem Sofer, for example, was violently opposed to the selling of rabbinical clothes. But that was, to some extent, normal. So anyway, the issue of immigration typically didn't become a problem. What became a problem was, frankly, getting the money to study full time.
Okay, let me ask another question and encourage people to write their questions in the chat function so you can have Tom respond. I don't think we know much about the Jews captured and made slaves, Tom. I know this would take.
Mindy, you just got muted. Can you unmute?
Okay, all right. Can you hear me? Tom?
Yes, now we can. Tom, now you're muted.
We're taking turns getting muted.
Tom, you need to unmute. Thank you.
Well, now anyone can unmute if they wish to.
All right, let me then rephrase my question, Tom. While people are thinking of questions to ask Tom, and we'll let you ask your own questions, I'd like Tom to say a little bit about Jews in captivity. This is a world most of us know nothing about. Do we have any memoirs? Do we have any stories? Did some people who became slaves have a chance to rise up in the societies in which they were enslaved and become viziers and advisors to the king? Were there some happy stories of those who were enslaved?
Tom, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Tom, you're muted. Tom,
We can't hear you.
Tom, please.
I got it. Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Well, first place, let's talk about two separate things, which are Jews who were captured and sold as slaves. They say they were usually redeemed and sent home. So that, Jews being slaves, I mean, there was a lot of money involved in this being people were captured, and after some time they got out, and they were, there are halachic issues about, status, particularly for women who had been captured, and they're all dealt with. But that wasn't, and the other thing you're referring to is, yes, as far as the general society is concerned, particularly Christians in Southeast Europe were captured. As the government officially just took them from their parents, forcibly converted them as children, made them into soldiers in Istanbul and in Cairo, and they over time became an elite group. And so, and a number of them became wazirs and so forth. But those Jews, by and large, weren't involved in that business. Most of them were former Christians, and it was a phenomenon. The system was ended in Istanbul, I think, in 1822. A purge in Cairo. Of course, the ruling dynasty, Muhammad Ismail, murdered them all in, was it 18 something? Anyway, invited them all to a party and then killed them all. But those were the phenomenon of janissaries, and there were comparable ones in India and so forth, of captured slaves. In the case of the Ottomans and the Cairo Ottomans, they tended to be captured Christians. Didn't really involve Jews. Now, Jews did buy slaves, and that was one of my papers. And in fact, they bought them up to the end of the Ottoman slavery. Ottoman slavery was abolished in 1889. And
Wow.
my paper is nice. There's a very wealthy banking family in Jerusalem called the Valeros, not related to the American service stations. And they're a big bank and for a couple hundred years. But anyway, at some point in the 1880s, just before slavery was out, they bought a Ethiopian slave. And the people who were bought tended to be women, and they tended to be bought to be married. People who couldn't find wives otherwise bought somebody and married them. And then over time, they were almost always freed, among other things, because, well, in the story of this slave in the 1880s, is the mother died. And so she actually raised the children. And indeed, she was the honored matriarch of the Valero household until she died in 1940. And if the Valeros still in Jerusalem have a family synagogue. Wealthy families like that had their own synagogues. And there's a big plaque for her until she died in, I say, 1940. She was freed in 1889, but she was the matriarch. Okay. And other slaves, well, some of them probably didn't do so well, but a large number of them married, and almost all of them were freed at some point. Because there's a whole Jewish law, which to a greater or lesser extent people actually followed, about the whole process of what happens when you buy a slave and then you free the slave and they become Jews, become full. This is one of the 4 ways to convert to Judaism, but rules and procedures. If you go into the Indian Jewish cemeteries, there are graves from, and it's true in even the cemetery in Amsterdam for the Sephardim. There are graves, and the name on the grave in India was the Meshuchrar. They were freed slaves.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a really interesting question from Rose and Analea. I hope I'm getting this right. She's wondering about the level of Jewish knowledge of the ordinary members of Jewish communities. How many people were learned enough to be able to justify a lack of hospitality by quoting or misquoting traditional sources?
You've raised a very reasonable thing. First place. I mean, we start the things I often think the vast majority of women were illiterate. And as we know, even in the 19th century in Eastern Europe, maybe 40% of Jewish males were illiterate. And I mean, illiterate, as you know, doesn't necessarily mean you're ignorant. You know some things despite that. But most people buy. It's Chaim Soloveitchik who says, and he's correct, that the United States today and the world today has Jews who are in relative terms far more Jewishly educated than any Jewish community has ever been. I mean, the number of people who can read Hebrew in the United States, it's going up. Okay, so yeah, but, and this is the point, these were not really very I mean, some of them actually had universal male suffrage. Some of them even had some female suffrage, but they were controlled by small groups of local elites who were wealthy, businessmen or whatever, and intermarried with the rabbis, and they, you know, in many cases did know. So when you had the rabbis who were, as I say, intermarried with and often themselves very wealthy, you know, responded to these arguments. I mean, they refer to them to the extent that the Jewish communities decided not to do what the books should say they should have done. It's not typically because they didn't know what the book said. It's just they decided that it wasn't practical. I mean, for example, during the after the Russo-Swedish Wars, the communities in Lithuania were just snowed under, but even communities like Amsterdam, etc., which were relatively wealthy, had problems. I mean, the Amsterdam community accepted everybody for a while. In fact, even the Sephardim, you know, who normally held their nose about the Ashkenazim, they provided some money, etc. But then pretty soon they figured that they should move them on, and they sent them in boats to go, you know, a few each to each of the Jewish communities along the Rhineland, etc. And sometimes they didn't want to go, and sometimes they went, and then they came back because it didn't work out in the communities on the Rhineland and so forth.
Okay, Betty Sinowitz asks a question. Were there any more secular Jews in these communities?
You know, the concept of a secular Jew in 1500 to 1600 is a highly questionable one. I mean, with Spinoza, but he was kicked out of the community. I mean, there are people who thought all kinds of things, and there are people, as The last question indicated didn't think anything. And they were criminals, and they were, you know, people. There were people who converted back and forth and so forth. But essentially, to be a member of the Jewish community, you had to conform to certain of the standards. And one of the things that happens during the 18th century is in many of the communities, the pressures to do that are less. I mean, people didn't. I mean, the classic one, as we know, is that a lot of them, they were prostitutes. And clearly none of the, well, I shouldn't say none, but the authorities wouldn't have approved of going to prostitutes, but they accepted the fact they existed. I mean, they accepted the fact there were all kinds of people who were deviating, but secular Jews in our concept, not really. It was a problem, I guess. The alternative was to convert to Christianity, which people did.
Okay, Jerry or Roz, do you want to unmute people and have them raise their hand?
People can unmute themselves at this point.
Okay, they should just jump in then.
I have a question though, Tom. With all these refugees being ransomed, basically, were there ever any cases of fraud where the person would make a deal with someone to pretend to be enslaved by the person so that they get the money? Like, you know, there's been cases that saw recently, you know, false ransom and stuff.
No, okay, that's, of course, I'm sure there probably were, and if the people who study the records would find them. The more common problem, I suspect, was people who weren't Jewish, who claimed to be Jewish because it was possible to get redeemed.
Uh-huh.
And that I would have thought, but frankly, I mean, it's a kind of question, if Adam Teller of Brown University, who wrote this book and had a whole section on the redemption business, comes around his lectures, maybe he knows some source that deals with the question of fraud, because he obviously went through the records of, not so much as far as I have to go back to the book. I don't think he actually has the records of the people in Istanbul, but he has a lot of the papers that the fund collectors carried around with them, and their correspondence, which was, let's say, in the Amsterdam community records or the Frankfurt community records.
Yeah,
I mean, the Polish community records are either there are two big archives that have some of them. Some of them are in Hebrew University. They have this thing called I think the Central Archive.
Central Archive of the Jewish people.
Something like that.
Yeah,
And then
I've been there.
some of them are in Devo, in New York.
Yeah, my daughter is no longer at Brown, so she graduated. I can't go back and talk to him.
I'm sure somebody, I presume, will at some point put him on a lecture thing. He's an Australian, incidentally, though, who's, before he went to Brown, he was most, I think, involved in British academic things.
Weren't there traveling traders who were fairly secular, or I have an image that there were many traveling merchants or traders at that time.
Yeah.
But they were.
What you're saying is when they were outside the community, they got, did they perhaps eat not kosher food? Yeah. When they're on the road, did they pray 3 times a day and light the tefillin and so forth? Nobody will never know. But I mean, there wasn't a movement of people who didn't do it. I mean, that's what Haskalah was about to some extent, or some of the more radical Haskalah people.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the early Haskalah people were quite orthodox. I mean, Strashun, for example, whose commentary on the Gemara is all the traditional yeshivas used. He was the man who the library in Vilna, which you've maybe seen some description of. He was a leading maskil. But that was that generation of masculine. And then by the late 19th century, there developed a number of, we say secular, but the key thing was that they were anti-religious, or in some cases, they were assimilationists, which is an overlap.
If there were,
The question is, were they anti-religious because they came to the conclusion that religion was wrong, or are they anti-religious not so much for that reason, but because they were anxious to assimilate and be part of their Russian or Polish or other national cultures?
Okay, we don't have any more questions on the chat. Let me ask this, and again, one could elaborate at length about the organized Jewish community and the networks there, Tom. If you have any interesting anecdotes on that or any interesting organizational thoughts, that would be interesting.
Back to the thing that I was talking about, which is in every community of any size. I mean, they were scattered. You want to get a real sense of this, you read something like the Hachnosis Kala by Agnon, which is a great novel. The English translation, Bridal Canopy, is not as good as it should be. If you want, there's a marvelous version in Hebrew with detailed interpretations by Abraham Held, who was I think a Bible professor at the seminary, though his son, Shai Held, is probably
oh, yes.
people know. But they were scattered households and so forth who depended on the major community. But every community, they had a kahila. It was a community. And depending on the country and the traditions and so forth, it had a sort of board of some sort. And again, the ones in Russia were abolished in 1944 by the government. And so after that period, Jewish organizations, to the extent that they existed, were things that would be more familiar with to us. They were voluntary associations. There was, for example, in Vilna, a lot of the former functions of the community were handled by a charitable trust. But what I say before that, and still today in Germany, in a number of the European countries, there's these juridical organizations which are called the community. And you're either a member or you're not a member. And almost all the communities are now democratic, and you vote, and there's some sort of groups of committees that run them, and they have officers, and they do various functions. They typically, incidentally, they fund the synagogues, or at least most of them. People who disagree often have their own synagogues. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't fund conservative and reform ones. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they are conservative and they fund Orthodox ones. And again, in the 19th century, there were cases where the community split, and they had two communities, so-called Ostrittsgemeinde, which there was an Orthodox community, but incidentally, typically the non-Orthodox community, the general Gemeinde, also had a Orthodox section. They provided Orthodox synagogues and so forth that people wanted them. But the Orthodox, the Ostrittsgemeinde, of which there were only, I think, 4, 6, or 8 in Germany for various reasons. I mean, Prussia permitted them, Bavaria did not permit them. So until at least the end of the German Empire, the Orthodox were very unhappy in Bavaria because they had to sit in the same communities as everybody else. And again, there were votes, and there were sometimes you had to pay a certain amount of tax or something to vote or whatever. Typically, they had male suffrage, but sometimes, as I say, each country was a little bit different. But these were juridical organizations, and typically within a country, they often had a federation of these juridical organizations. And in Poland, starting several hundred years before it was abolished in 1764, they had each of the 4 lands which composed the Polish kingdom. There's Lita, and I think Polin is the central Poland, and probably Galicia is a separate one, and maybe Ukraine's a separate one. I'm not even sure what the other three were. They had their own VOD, and then once a year at I think the Leipzig Fair, all four of the communities would get together and they would make decisions for a country as a whole. It was called the VOD Arba Aratzos. And things were there. And then with modernization and secularization,
Sorry.
and then modernization and secularization, they were less, they dissolved, as I say. Basically, for example, the reason they dissolved in many countries is the government did not like the idea of having a state within a state, because that's what Jews were. I mean, something that I have in the essay I've been talking about here, which is pre-modern Jews. They had opinions. They certainly felt that they should be charitable to non-Jews, etc. But as a matter of fact, they were highly autonomous, and they typically had no say about government policy. And in reverse, they were expected to take care of Jews. So the whole discussion of refugees has to do with the question of Jewish refugees. Again, if you'd ask people, and there are actually sources for this and different things, what happens if a non-Jewish refugee shows up? Well, you try to help them, yeah. But the assumption was that mostly you're talking about Jewish communities dealing with Jewish refugees.
Is this related in any way to the more or less current practice whereby if some poor Jews are coming through the community supports them, gives them money to keep going or to eat or to have boarding or whatever? I mean, I know when I was a vice president of a small synagogue in New Mexico, one of my duties was to go to support, itinerant Jews who came to town.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, I think what you're talking about is, mushalachim of various sorts. And a very traditional way to raise funds was to send somebody around from community to community. In my youth, if you'd gone to a daily service, there were, 2 or 3 times a week, there'd be these bearded guys from one or another yeshiva collecting money. And they still exist to some extent. That's the paper on yeshiva finance. They were indeed an important element in the financing of 19th century Eastern European yeshivas. For that matter, 20th century European yeshivas. But instead, they weren't terribly efficient because you got to support the mashulach. So half of the money went to support the guy who was going around raising the money.
Yeah,
And that's, to some extent, this was a problem with the network we've been talking about, which is to raise funds. They sent these learned rabbis to Amsterdam and Frankfurt. The issue, the various kollels in, not kollels, they had various, each country had a institution in Israel which supported the people from that country, and they would send representatives to raise funds. But of course, there was a cost involved. But the other thing is the people who came were often learned. They gave speeches, they gave lectures. You look at the Calcutta records in the 19th century, a couple of times a month, somebody would show up in morning services. And at that point, they started the service at 4:30 in the morning. If a fundraiser came, he'd come and lecture from 3:30. So everybody would come and listen, and those who had the money give, and then he'd go on to the next synagogue.
Rose and Analia, you have some fascinating tales. Could you unmute yourself and tell the group here what you've just written in chat?
Well, I just said that these guys with beards and little pushkas used to come to our house every Sunday morning, usually after services. And if they were lucky, my father was already home, but otherwise my mother didn't think too highly of them. But they used to come like really like every single Sunday morning, like around noon, somebody would come to our house looking for money to support some yeshiva and some forlorn somewhere or other. And most of them, I think, came from New York, although they all had foreign accents, but some came from Boston also.
Was your father very active in the Jewish community? How did they know about it?
Yeah, well, he and his father also, we belonged to who were rather small. The shul that we belonged to was a merger of about 7 little, one-room steebles that was the first modern iteration. But when I drive around, like in the southern part of Providence, you see like there used to be about 25 of these little stiblach, and now there's not even one Orthodox shul in that section of town. But so by the time I was a kid, it was down to about 2. And my father was very active in the bigger one, or the more prosperous one, let's say, which was still not terribly prosperous, but more so than other places.
Does anyone else want to share anything in terms of their own experiences with representatives from far-flung Jewish communities looking for support, or any further questions for Tom? As you can see, Tom can talk just about anything. So don't
I noticed a question
story about those schnorrs that come to the door. My mother once gave to one of these men, and my father was appalled. He said, I can't believe you gave to one of these schnorrs. She said, but you had to hear him talk. He sounded exactly like my great-grandfather.
I have to say, I noticed the question asked, and it's a reasonable one, about, as you know, Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. Then they said a lot of them did go to North Africa, but there was a lot of resistance, and in fact, the communities remained to some extent separate, much more than in the Ottoman areas they took over. But they asked about the expulsion from England in 1290 and France in 1306. And there were a couple thousand people. It was a big problem. But they were absorbed basically in the Rhineland mostly. A few of them got to Israel and so forth, or Spain. Anyway, there doesn't, and there are, I'm sure if we were to look through, one of the key sources for this kind of historical research is the response to literature, the questions people ask rabbis. Now, obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, they're typically not general questions of public policy. They're very specific, which is so-and-so showed up in my community having been kicked out of London. What are our obligations to him? Okay. It's very interesting. I mean, I'm sure somebody could do some research in which they, on the basis of this, basically these records, because we don't have too many other records from this period. We have some, obviously. I mean, we have the things where we have the statements from the Jewish community of Canterbury and the Jewish community of Paris restricting admission, and obviously they have other records. But in Pacific about the German and French refugees. Of course, again, in all of these cases, and the case of the Polish refugees we were talking about, a lot of people got killed or they died in flight. So they didn't even get to be refugees.
Would there have been any distinction between helping families that had many children, because that would be more dependents and more people to help than those?
I mean, the answer, I think, is that they would have been happy. I mean, there was the additional cost to accommodate children in that period wasn't as high as you might think. It's one of the reasons they had high infant mortality and so forth.
Sure.
I think they would. One of the quotes that I get, you might be interested. One of the quotes that I give in this essay is, all of you know about Glickle of Hamelin?
Yeah.
Glickle of Hamelin was a well, we'd say a housewife, I guess, but in Germany, late 17th, early 18th century. And she wrote a very colorful diary in Yiddish, which has become a classic. And she has opinions on other things. She outlived 3 husbands. She was a very successful businessman, rather tough lady. I mean, and not sometimes nasty lady. But one of her stories is when she was a girl, a young girl, these refugees came from the Russo-Spanish War, and everybody in the town in Hamburg, she was, took in whoever they could, and she had a whole bunch of refugees who were in the attic of her house, which her grandmother was taking care of, and they were all sick, so they were being nursed by the local ladies. Unfortunately, a number of them died, and also her grandmother, a number of the other ladies died because of whatever the Debbie Weiner is telling me she's 1646, 1724. But anyway, she has this old quote about the family dealing with these sick Polish refugees. Because, of course, one of the things going on is the German Jews, well, first place, the German Jews thought they were superior to the Polish Jews. The Polish Jews didn't necessarily agree, but, and so they were, this noblesse oblige that they were taking care of them. And again, you know, everything changes. One of the refugees was father or grandfather of Jacob Emden, who became the chief rabbi of Amsterdam in the next generation. You know, so obviously many of the refugees in a generation or two, as I mentioned, a couple of one of the families in Hamburg became the progenitors of a number of the leading court Jews of the 18th century. I think, among others, the family was the court Jew to the Elector of Prussia, which was a rather good place to be a court Jew to.
Okay, we're close to our finishing time. Jerry, do you want to say anything?
About next week's class?
Or anything else? Tom, do you have any final thoughts?
No, but we did cover all the questions that came in chat, I gather.
That is right. Yes, indeed.
I did have some questions, but I was muted. I couldn't figure out how to unmute. I want to first thank Tom for both doing the class and for your very nice responses to these questions that we've been putting to you. I think I've learned as much from the questions as from the formal presentation, but they were both very informative. And I want to thank Mindy for her assistance in both scheduling the class and running things, as well as Roz in helping to run things. And I want to welcome everyone, you know, to the class, but also tell you that, you know, next week we're having a class on the Romaniati. Is that pronounced it correctly, Mindy?
Romania.
We'll find out from Marsha Haddad next week, since she's a member of that community.
Greek-speaking Jew.
From Slavia, basically. They were mentioned briefly by Tom's presentation. And the lady who's doing it is the director of the museum, I think, there, and a member of the synagogue. There is a synagogue of these people in New York City, and it should be a very interesting class. So I hope to see many or most of you or all of you next week also. And again, our classes are free and donations are very welcome, welcome. And thank you again, Tom.
Thank you.